Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 36 of my historical travel podcast Voyage to go, history, where I take you on some of the most adventurous journeys of the past, expeditions that still shape how we understand the world today. In the true story I'm currently telling, we follow 17-year-old German Georg Forster, who traveled around the world in the 18th century with his father, a naturalist, aboard the HMS Resolution under Captain James Cook. Georg's account was written in the formal language of his time, so I have translated most of it into modern English for clarity. His knowledge reflects the scientific and cultural understanding of the late 18th century. As we follow his journey, I'll occasionally step in to provide additional context and explanation. So let's hoist the sails and head deeper into uncharted waters with Georg, Captain Cook, and the rest of the Resolution's crew. What happened in the last episode?
In the previous episode, we remained in Queen Charlotte Sound on the South Island of New Zealand, where the encounter with the Maori people turned unexpectedly grim. As the British officers explored nearby settlements, they discovered horrifying remains, evidence of cannibalism. The locals confirmed without shame that they had consumed the body of a young enemy killed in battle. Back aboard the Resolution, this shocking cultural practice was further demonstrated when a slice of human flesh was cooked and eaten in front of the entire crew. Reactions ranged from revulsion to morbid curiosity. One figure stood out in this unsettling episode, Maheine, the young man from the Society Islands. Overcome with grief, he broke down, not out of fear or disgust, but out of deep empathy for the slain boy's parents. His response reflected a rare and profound emotional insight that deeply moved Georg. As the Resolution departed New Zealand and sailed into colder southern waters, Maheine experienced something new: snow. He watched in wonder as white stones melted in his hands, later calling the snowfall white rain. For Georg, this moment, so full of innocence and curiosity, offered a poignant contrast to the horror they had left behind. It was a reminder that even amid darkness, wonder still had a place on this voyage.
Friday, November 26th, 1773, 49 degrees south, South Pacific.
The monotonous voyage made Maheine increasingly restless. The salted food and the cold weather added to his growing dislike of traveling. His main pastime was removing the red feathers from the dance aprons he had bought on Tongatabu. He tied 8 or 10 of them together and secured them with coconut fibers. The rest of the time he spent on deck with the officers or by the fire in the captain's cabin. In their free moments, they took advantage of his company to study the Tahitian language. They went through the dictionary they had compiled in the Society Islands and gained new insights about the islands which would be useful upon their return. On the morning of December 15th, they saw ice fields in several directions. They were so surrounded that it seemed impossible to continue heading south. They had to steer north-northeast to return to open water. The fog that had appeared in the morning grew thicker by midday. The numerous masses of ice around them posed great danger. At 1 p.m., just as the crew was eating, they were startled by the sudden appearance of a large iceberg directly in front of them. It was impossible to turn the ship. The only option left was to sail as close to the wind as possible to avoid the danger. The minutes before their fate was decided were spent in dreadful uncertainty. They were very lucky to have escaped without damage. As they passed the ice mass, it came within barely a ship's width. Such and similar dangers constantly accompanied them on this unknown ocean. Yet the crew was far less worried than one might expect. Just as death in battle loses its horror, they too sailed on, often only a hand's breadth from fresh danger, without concern. The icebergs again took on various shapes: pyramids, obelisks, church towers, and ruins. Some were as large as the block of ice they had seen during their first voyage in 1772, some equally flat on top. The many birds they had seen so far might have led other travelers to believe that land was nearby, but they were used to seeing birds far out at sea and did not take this as a sign of land. Blue petrels, albatrosses, and occasionally skuas accompanied them daily. As they neared the ice, they also saw snow petrels, Antarctic shearwaters, and fulmars. Penguins, seaweed, and seals had not been seen since the 10th. The weather was very wet and uncomfortably cold. The doves they had purchased on the Society and Friendly Islands did poorly. The songbirds they had laboriously caught in New Zealand also suffered. Georg's father and he had taken 5 doves, all of which died before December 16th because it was very cold in their cabins. The sailors' sleeping quarters were warmer. The thermometer in their own cabins never showed more than 5 degrees above the outside temperature. Because their quarters unfortunately lay directly in front of the mainmast, they were always drafty, and rain or storm often brought water inside. In the afternoon of December 16th and again on the 17th, they launched the boats to collect loose pieces of ice for their water barrels. The ice was old and streaked with salt water, as it had been drifting in the sea for a long time. The water from it was drinkable, if the salt water could be drained off. From the 17th to the 20th, they saw no birds. They seemed to have disappeared suddenly for reasons unknown. On the 20th, however, some albatrosses reappeared. As they had now sailed past the ice field, they turned south again, since that was the main goal of their journey. In the afternoon of the 20th, they crossed the Antarctic Circle for the second time. The weather was wet and foggy, icebergs surrounded them, and the wind was brisk. A multitude of Antarctic petrels, along with a whale that spouted water close to the ship, seemed to welcome them into the cold region. That night they spotted 2 seals, creatures they hadn't seen in 2 weeks. Some companions believed this meant land was near, but that hope was soon crushed as they sailed southward to 67 degrees, 12 minutes latitude without seeing anything but ice. In the afternoon of the 23rd, they were surrounded by icebergs, and the sea was nearly covered with small pieces of floating ice. They stopped, launched the boats, and hauled ice blocks aboard. Many birds flew around them, and the officers shot a few Antarctic petrels from the boats, giving them the chance to create drawings and descriptions. At this time, many began complaining of rheumatic pains, headaches, swollen glands, and chills, which they blamed on the drinking water made from melted ice. Georg's father had been feeling unwell for several days due to a cold, which now developed into severe rheumatism with fever and left him bedridden. Both ailments seemed caused by the poor condition of their cabin, where everything was molding and rotting from constant dampness. The cold on that day was so intense that there was only a 2.5-degree difference between the thermometer inside the cabin and the one on deck. Once the boats had been brought back aboard, they sailed north that night and throughout the following day, as far as the unfavorable wind would allow. On the 25th, the weather was clear and calm. The wind dropped and complete stillness followed. At noon, they counted more than 90 large icebergs around them. Since it was Christmas, the captain, as tradition demanded, invited all officers to lunch. One of the lieutenants hosted the petty officers. The sailors received a double portion of pudding and enjoyed their rum, which they had saved for months to properly celebrate this day. To them, this was all that mattered. Everything else was of no concern. The sight of the vast ice masses drifting around them in the current, threatening to crush the ship at any moment, did not stop their celebration. They said that as long as the rum held out, they would celebrate Christmas as Christians, even if all the elements had turned against them. Their seafaring life had long hardened them. Danger, hard work, and harsh weather no longer fazed them. Their muscles had grown stiff, their nerves dulled, and their temperaments desensitized. Since they felt little concern for their own safety, it was natural that they had even less empathy for others. Living under strict orders, they also showed a certain tyranny toward those in their power. They longed for war, and the habit of killing had become a passion. That much was clear from how eagerly they took aim at islanders whenever the chance arose. Their way of life distanced them from domestic joys, and coarse desires replaced nobler feelings. Though they were members of so-called civilized nations, they had become a distinct class of human beings, hardened, impulsive, vengeful, yet also brave, honest, and loyal to one another. At noon, they measured the sun's altitude and confirmed that they were at 66 degrees 22 minutes south latitude, once again south of the Antarctic Circle. While inside the circle, they had experienced almost no night. In Georg's father's journal were many entries written just before midnight by daylight. Even on this night, the sun barely dipped below the horizon, and twilight remained. Maheine was amazed by this phenomenon and could hardly believe his eyes. No explanation they gave made any sense to him. He said that back home no one would believe his tales of frozen rain and the eternal day. At 6 a.m., they counted 105 large icebergs surrounding them. The weather remained clear, calm, and beautiful. At noon the following day, they were still in the same position, but the crew was drunk. From the mast, they counted 168 icebergs, some nearly a kilometer long, and none smaller than the ship. The view was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. It felt as if they were gazing upon the wreckage of a shattered world or a hellish landscape straight from a poet's vision. That impression was only intensified by the constant swearing and cursing of the sailors. In the afternoon, a light wind picked up, allowing them to slowly sail north. The farther they moved away from the Antarctic Circle, the fewer icebergs they saw. At 4 o'clock the next morning, they launched the boats to collect fresh ice. Hardly had they finished when the wind shifted, bringing snow and hail from the northeast. Georg's father and 12 others began complaining once again of rheumatic pain and had to stay in bed. Although scurvy had not yet appeared in a dangerous form, Georg and all others with even mild symptoms had to drink warm beer wort twice a day and avoid salted food as much as possible. Even though no serious illness had yet broken out, everyone looked exhausted and gaunt, an ominous sign. Captain Cook himself appeared pale and thin, had no appetite, and suffered from persistent constipation. They now steered north as fast as the wind allowed. On January 1st, 1774, at 59 degrees and 7 minutes south latitude, they finally lost sight of the ice. On the 4th, a strong westerly wind arose, forcing them to double reef all sails. The high waves tossed the ship violently from side to side. This rough weather continued until noon on the 6th, when they reached the 51st parallel and began sailing north-northeast with a favorable wind. They were now not far from the route they had taken in June and July during their voyage from New Zealand to Tahiti. They intentionally sailed in this direction to leave no part of this vast ocean unexplored. Up to that point, they had not seen any land, nor even signs of it. On their first journey, they had crossed the South Pacific between 40 and 50 degrees south latitude. This time, by Christmas, they had explored most of the stretch between 60 degrees and the Antarctic Circle. From Christmas to now, as they sailed north, they had passed through the area between those two routes. So if they had missed any land, it could only be a small island, likely unimportant to England due to its remoteness and harsh climate. To thoroughly examine a sea as vast as the South Pacific would have required many separate voyages, something a single ship on one expedition could never achieve. For Georg and the others, it was enough to prove that no large continent existed in the temperate latitudes of the South Pacific, and if any did exist, it had to lie within the Antarctic Circle.
In earlier centuries, many scholars firmly believed that there must be a great unknown continent in the southern part of our planet, the so-called Terra Australis Incognita. The term means something like unknown southern land. This idea was based on an old principle of balance. People assumed that there had to be a vast landmass in the south to counterbalance the continents of the northern hemisphere. This theory persisted in geography for centuries, despite the lack of any solid evidence. That's why James Cook received a clear order from the British Admiralty to find this hypothetical southern continent or to prove that it didn't exist. This was one of the main reasons behind his second voyage around the world. For Georg Forster and the other naturalists on board, it was enough to demonstrate that no large unknown landmass in the temperate latitudes of the South Pacific. Still, the possibility remained that a continent might exist within the Arctic Circle. And indeed, today we know that this continent exists. It's called Antarctica. It is about 1.5 times the size of Europe and almost entirely covered in ice, on average more than 2 kilometers thick. But in Cook's time, that was completely unknown. The HMS Resolution was unable to reach the continent, even though it pushed farther south than any ship before it. The reason? Massive ice fields and endless belts of pack ice blocked the cruise path. Even during the Antarctic summer, the ice remained unbroken. The men could see icebergs and snow squalls, but never the mainland itself. And so they circumnavigated the southern continent without ever setting foot on it. It would take decades before anyone even caught sight of the Antarctic mainland. But Cook had shown that no large landmass existed outside the ice, disproving a centuries-old myth.
Their long stay in these cold latitudes was becoming more and more unbearable. The hope of returning home this year, which had kept up their spirits until now, was gone. At first, silent despair could be seen on every face because many feared that they would have to sail south again the following year. Gradually, the men resigned themselves to their fate and endured it with quiet acceptance. What depressed them the most was the constant uncertainty about their future course, since it was being kept secret for no clear reason. For several days, they sailed directly to the northeast. On January 11th, at 47 degrees and 52 minutes south latitude, the thermometer read 11 degrees Celsius or 52 degrees Fahrenheit. At noon, they changed course and headed southeast again. There was hardly any need to say how damaging such frequent and sudden climate changes were to their health.
Saturday, January 15th, 1774, Southern Ocean.
Today the wind grew stronger and soon turned into a violent storm. Around 9 in the evening, a massive wave crashed over the ship and flooded the deck. Water rushed through every opening, extinguished the lanterns, and left the crew uncertain for a moment whether the ship was already sinking. In Georg's father's cabin, water poured in. Even his bed was soaked. Under such conditions, his rheumatic pain, which had troubled him for 2 weeks, grew worse until he could barely move. Life aboard was miserable, even for the healthy. For those who were sick and in pain, it was nearly unbearable. The ocean raged around them as if angry at the boldness of this small group of humans who dared to face it. The faces of their fellow travelers reflected dark melancholy, and a fearful silence filled the ship. The salted provisions, their daily food, had become so revolting that even seasoned sailors were disgusted. Mealtime was dreaded, for the mere smell of the food killed all appetite. This journey could not be compared to any of their previous ones. They now endured hardships and dangers unknown to earlier explorers of the South Sea who had mostly stayed within the tropics or temperate zones. There the weather was mild and the land offered occasional refreshment. A voyage like that would have been a pleasure trip, with new and often pleasant sights to keep them happy and healthy. But their journey south was the complete opposite. Monotonous, filled with ice, fog, storms, and restless seas. The climate was cold and the food was nearly rotten and unfit to eat. In short, they lived like withering plants, indifferent to everything that might once have stirred their spirits. They sacrificed health, joy, and feeling for the doubtful honor of crossing an untouched path. The sailors suffered just as much as the officers, though for different reasons. The ship's biscuits, which had been freshly baked and packed in New Zealand, were now nearly as bad as before. The inspection back then hadn't been strict enough, and so spoiled bread remained in storage. To save supplies, the men were given only 2/3 of their usual ration, but even a full ration, if it had been edible, would have barely satisfied them. The reduced amount of spoiled bread was completely inadequate. That continued until the first petty officer approached the captain, complaining of his men's hunger and holding up a piece of the rotten, foul-smelling biscuit. After that, the men received full rations again. On the 20th, at 62 degrees south latitude, they reached the first icebergs, but their number did not increase as they continued south. On the 26th, they crossed the Antarctic Circle again and saw only a few drifting ice sheets. That day they thought they saw mountains in the distance, but after a few hours the clouds that they had mistaken for peaks drifted away. The next day at noon they found themselves at 67 degrees and 52 minutes south latitude, closer to the pole than ever before, yet no ice stopped their progress. The blue petrels and pintado petrels continued to follow them, but the albatrosses had vanished some time ago.
Wednesday, January 28th, 1774, Southern Ocean.
That afternoon they passed through a vast field of broken ice. The boats were lowered to haul ice blocks aboard and replenish the ship's water supply. By midnight, the thermometer had not dropped below 1 degree Celsius. Come morning, they enjoyed the warmest sunshine they had experienced in those icy regions. Georg's father, after 4 weeks confined to bed, finally dared to step back on deck. Their hope was to push as far south as other seafarers had managed to reach in the far north. But on the morning of the 30th, they discovered an immense ice field stretching from east to west. It rose several meters above the surface of the sea. Jagged ice blocks were piled up across its surface, and a barrier of broken ice floated before it. They were now at 71 degrees and 10 minutes south latitude, only about 2,100 kilometers from the South Pole. Any further progress was impossible. They turned back, satisfied with the extent of their perilous expedition, convinced that no sailor would ever go beyond this point. Their longitude was about 106 degrees and 54 minutes west. The thermometer stood at 0 degrees. Penguins could be heard screeching loudly, though the fog kept them hidden from view. So far, every attempt to venture farther south had led to the same outcome. No land in sight, and always stopped sooner or later by massive ice fields. The winds in these high southern latitudes were usually moderate and often came from the east, much like in the north. From this, Georg's father concluded that the entire region around the South Pole, up to roughly 20 degrees south, must be covered by solid ice. The outer edges of this ice were likely broken off annually by storms, melted by the sun, and reformed during the winter. This theory seemed all the more plausible as ice formation didn't require land, and there was little reason to believe that large land masses existed in that region. From the edge of the ice field, they sailed northward under light winds until February 5th. On that day, after a brief calm, a fresh breeze set in. On the 6th, the wind shifted southeast and grew so strong during the night that several sails were torn. But as it carried them quickly northward, they paid little mind to its force. In just 24 hours, they covered over 330 kilometers. The favorable winds held steady until February 12th, bringing them as far north as 50 degrees and 15 minutes south latitude. The thermometer climbed to 9 degrees. Finally, they were informed that, like the previous year, they would spend the winter among the tropical islands of the Pacific. The prospect of new discoveries and explorations lifted the crew's spirits. Still, many continued to suffer from rheumatic pain, some unable to move. The weakest recovered only slowly, as the food was both scarce and spoiled. Sauerkraut had kept scurvy at bay, but wasn't nourishing enough on its own. The ship's biscuits had gone moldy, and the salted meat had become nearly inedible from the brine. Georg's father, who had often been unwell during the southern expedition, was now suffering from toothaches, swollen cheeks, and a sore throat. His whole body ached well into mid-February, and he moved like a shadow across the deck. The warmer weather eased his suffering, but it proved detrimental to the captain's health. Cook's gall troubles had disappeared during the cold southern voyage, but his appetite had never returned. Now he was again plagued by severe constipation, which, at first, he tried to ignore. His attempt to cure it by fasting only made things worse. In the end, the intensity of his symptoms forced him to seek medical help. Several treatments failed to bring relief, but warm baths and soothing plasters finally did. All the while they continued swiftly northward under sail. Now, night no longer existed, and the sun shone even at midnight.
Tuesday, February 22nd, 36 degrees and 10 minutes south latitude, Southern Ocean.
The albatrosses that had accompanied them disappeared. At 94.5 degrees west longitude, they changed course to the southwest to search for a supposed discovery near Juan Fernandez. By noon on the 23rd, they had reached 37 degrees and 50 minutes south latitude and approximately 101 degrees west longitude, but they found no land. Due to the captain's severe illness, it was urgent to reach a place where the crew could recover. The captain's survival depended on it. On February 26th, Captain Cook was feeling somewhat better thanks to the prescribed medication. Over the next 3 days, he recovered to the point where he could occasionally sit upright and take a little soup. His recovery was mainly due to the skill of the ship's surgeon, Mr. Patton. It was only through his efforts that the voyage could continue as planned. The hope of new discoveries and the harmony on board rested solely on Cook's health. The doctor, who had cared for him tirelessly, risked his own life in doing so. After countless sleepless nights and barely any rest during the day, he was completely exhausted. He eventually fell ill himself with a dangerous gall disease, made even more threatening by his weakened state. Had there not soon been land in sight to strengthen him with fresh supplies, he would have lost his life. Since February 22nd, they had been experiencing easterly winds, likely influenced by the sun's position in the southern hemisphere. The climate became more pleasant, with the thermometer reading 21 degrees Celsius. Occasionally, gray noddies appeared, birds that, according to Maheine, never fly far from land. On March 1st, Bonito swam past the ship, and the following day, at 30 degrees south latitude, they once again spotted tropical birds. But at the same time, scurvy was spreading on board. Georg himself suffered from severe pain, bruising, rotting gums, and swollen legs. Within just a few days, the symptoms had greatly weakened him. Although he had avoided spoiled food, it had so weakened his stomach that he couldn't drink enough maltwort to ease the illness. Other crew members were barely able to crawl across the deck. From March 3rd to 6th, there was almost a complete calm. The weather was warm and sunny, but the lack of wind prevented them from moving forward. The crew longed desperately for a place where they could refresh themselves.
That brings us to the end of episode 36 of Georg Forster's journey around the world aboard the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. A map with the key locations from this episode is linked in the show notes. If you'd like to see how these places look today, visit my YouTube channel Voyage to Go, where I trace Forster's path and explore the echoes of history in the present day. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next part of our expedition. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support my work, you'll find the PayPal link in the show notes. The journey continues, and I'd love to have you along for the next chapter. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.